Welcome to Houston House at South by Southwest. I'm Natalie Harms, editor of Innovation Map. Houston has an incredible history of innovation. Over the last several years, the region has doubled down on bolstering our innovation ecosystem, and the progress is staggering. I joined Josh Pherigo, Director of Research and Data Analytics at the Greater Houston Partnership, to take a data-driven look at the current trends in the startup space and the Houston region's momentum in building a thriving innovation ecosystem. Josh, thanks so much for joining me today. It's so good to catch up with you.
It's good to catch up with you, Natalie. It's good to be in the same room with you.
Absolutely. So before we really dive in, tell me a little bit about you and what you do for GHP.
So I am the research director of data analytics at the partnership. And a big part of what I do on the research team is I watch the innovation sector of the economy. And so I look at what are the areas where we're growing the most in terms of life science or digital technology or even space technology, just kind of what's next in the economy. And that's what I spend a lot of my time on.
Yes, the de facto numbers guy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what have you observed in the startup world over this past year? It's
been a very wild ride. Like a lot of sectors, digital technology and innovation, in particular, all the sectors that receive venture capital funding have been affected a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. Venture capital funding got interrupted, like a lot of industries. During the shutdown initially, VC funding kind of came to a halt. And what happened was venture capitalists couldn't sit on their hands forever. They have a job to do. And so they kind of pivoted toward technologies that were a little bit more mature. And so what that has meant over the last year is that seed stage, earlier stage funding has slowed down. So early stage startups have had a little bit more trouble getting that initial capital that they need. It's just been harder to meet venture capitalists, right? It's a relationship that you have to develop with those folks. And so immediately, venture capitalists went back to their Rolodex and they started looking through and they started writing bigger checks to companies that were a little bit more established with their technology, so more growth stage funding. So what that has meant is that volume-wise, dollars have actually increased slightly, both in the US and here in Houston, but the deal flow has slowed down. So bigger checks to fewer companies. Mm-hmm. Sector-wise, telehealth and health technology companies have done really well. And so Houston has been fortunate because we have some promising companies in telemedicine and in digital health. So that's been good for Houston in some ways.
Looking into 2021, are we going to see a return of seed funding?
Yeah, absolutely. It's already starting to kind of come back. It was really two issues were happening that were kind of preventing that. One was just the logistics of how do we meet new startup companies. Mm-hmm. And so that has kind of worked out. People have gotten more comfortable doing meet and greets online, doing virtual meetings. Like that has become a little bit more common practice in the space. So VCs are starting to rebuild their kind of Rolodex or their pipeline, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The second issue that was happening was that venture capitalists just weren't sure what technologies to fund. The paradigm has really shifted. And so companies that may have seemed promising before the pandemic aren't necessarily promising post-pandemic, right? And so it has taken a while to work out what is the new kind of risk profile. And so both of those problems are starting to get sorted out. It's starting to become a little bit more clear, how to source new companies and also which technologies need funding now.
So I definitely saw that reporting during 2020, the reaction, the knee-jerk reaction that VCs had. But I wonder almost if it's to Houston's advantage in the future that VCs are comfortable with hopping on a Zoom call versus flying out to Houston. That maybe that ask of flying out to Houston is too much, but a Zoom call from a VC in the Bay Area looking into a Houston company, maybe that opens the door a little bit now that they're more comfortable with that.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It absolutely opens doors. Also, something that's been helpful has been that Houston has a lot more startup development organizations that are helping to make those introductions. So we have a lot more folks who make the introductions to these venture capitalists and then host events. Like we had Venture Houston here hosted, which was an excellent online conference. And that kind of gave a lot more visibility to venture capitalists, to Houston companies that don't always, weren't pre-pandemic maybe as open to coming to Houston necessarily. It wasn't on their kind of their bus tour, so to speak, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're talking about, the perspective outside in on Houston. So what really does make Houston different from other markets that are either already established, maybe down the street in Texas? What's our difference factor?
Houston has this incredible history, this legacy of innovation, but a lot of that innovation has come from the institutions that we have here. So we're well known for having, NASA, the home of manned spaceflight. We invented mission control. That whole idea of having a giant screen and then a bunch of engineers sitting there and problem solving real time, that was invented right here in Houston. The oil and gas industry, sprang up basically out of Houston. And so there's, an incredible number of innovations that have popped up. But a lot of it has been centered around solving, engineering type problems at industrial scale. And so that still exists, but it doesn't quite get as much, coverage as, say, a lot of the like apps or the mobile technologies or things that are a little bit more consumer facing. So what Houston does well is solve critical, huge engineering problems using technology. And that happens every day. And what we're starting to see more of are tech companies spinning out of those large institutions, those large corporations. You have a company called High Radius in Houston right now. It's a fintech company. It's worth over $1 billion. That company came out of an engineer at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And Hewlett-Packard Enterprise spun out of Compaq being here. And Compaq spun out of, Texas Instruments, right? And so Texas Instruments was originally servicing the oil and gas industry. You can kind of make that line from a lot of the tech companies that we have, feeding back into either NASA or energy. It spawns a lot of new tech startups, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I want like a visualization of this, like an actual chart, like an ancestry tree of these companies that are moving and shaking in Houston. So what other elements are here in Houston already? Because you mentioned we have this, like Houston has been an innovative city forever, like before it was even cool to be. So, what other infrastructure is here already that we can really make the most out of?
So we have the largest medical center in the world. And what that means is we have millions of patients coming here to Houston seeking treatment. I think it's 8 to 9 million patients a year come to the medical center seeking treatment. We also have some incredible innovation and science and research that is coming out of that medical center. And what we've seen recently is more growth on that side of the house. So more growth when it comes to research scientists and NIH, or National Institutes of Health funding, things like that. A few years ago, we had the Texas Medical Center Innovation Institute pop up in 2014. That has really changed the game in attracting startups to Houston. And so we've seen just a lot of activity around bringing in talented engineers, talented scientists who are focused on solving health problems. Oncology is an incredible strength for Houston that I don't think people realize as much. We have just, a knowledge base unlike really any other place in the country, other than possibly, Boston. Houston rivals Boston when it comes to oncology and, therapeutics, things like that. So, that infrastructure around life science is critical and it's growing. The other side of that would be energy. So we have a lot of large energy companies based here, and all of those companies are transitioning to be carbon neutral. That is going to create new jobs in clean energy. those skills transfer easily. So I think those two areas are places where we have an infrastructure advantage.
Yeah. When you think about all of these different industries that have a lot of momentum, but maybe that message isn't being communicated widely, like, do you think Houston has a perception problem? Like, we know as Houstonians, there's so much cool stuff going on, but does the rest of the world, and how do we tell them?
Yeah, exactly. I think we do have a perception problem.
Yeah.
That's because a lot of our super innovative, highly skilled employees are kind of buried in other industries that are not as much front and center thought of by the broader country as being tech focused. And energy is one of those. We also have just a number of Fortune 500 companies. I think the number is like 24 right now, right? With the announcement that HPE just relocated to Houston. So I'll give you an example. Waste management, the largest trash and recycling company in the world, is headquartered in Houston. And so a data scientist at Waste Management, that's a highly skilled job that maybe doesn't show up necessarily on a best tech hubs in the United States watch list, right? But those jobs exist. And so those skills, those engineering skills, maybe they're at Chevron, maybe they're at Waste Management, maybe they're at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, but they transfer easily. They're tech skills, right? It's just not as much on people's radar.
Yeah. I think a lot of people still really, identify Houston as a developing innovation ecosystem. But the truth is it's really come a long way. Like the Houston we see today versus 10 years ago, it's a different city when you talk about tech and innovation. So what has contributed to that growth?
We intended to grow it. I think that's the most important thing is that the civic community got together, the business community got together with a really intentional view that this is an area of the economy that we want to improve. And so there has been effort put behind creating new institutions, creating new nonprofits. Houston Exponential didn't exist a few years ago. I mentioned Texas Medical Center and the Innovation Institute. That was one of the first, of this kind of new crop of startup development organizations and incubator spaces and accelerators. We've doubled the number of innovation kind of ecosystem assets that we have in the region. We have, over 50 startup development organizations and co-working spaces. So there is a better network here to support tech entrepreneurs than there ever has been before in Houston. And that's important. Tech founders need to know that they have a good support system in the city that they're locating in. One of the benefits from doing this work has just been that we have elevated the status of a tech founder in Houston. Before, a lot of folks starting software companies might have told you that they feel like they play a little bit second fiddle because Houston may be seen as an oil and gas town. I don't think that you're going to find that same message anymore. I think tech founders have really been elevated and kind of put on a little bit more on a pedestal in terms of, hey, we value what you do and you're important here. Because we know how important diversifying the economy is.
Yeah. I said 10 years, but honestly, it's been like 5 years, right? That this remarkable change has happened.
Yeah, you write about the founders all the time, Natalie. You know very well how many really cool companies are springing up all the time, right?
And infrastructure. If you talk about like accelerators and different types of startup development organizations, it was like 2019, it was every other week I was writing about a new one coming to Houston. So it's definitely exciting and a lot all at once, right?
Yeah, exactly. The Ion, that was just a drawing, a concept drawing. And if you go a couple miles from here to the old Sears building, it doesn't look like an old Sears building anymore, right? That's sprung to life.
Yeah, definitely a pivotal moment. So we are at this kind of pivotal moment now with all of this growth. What's the next phase for Houston? Or are we still in this kind of developing phase? And what's the change that kind of is going to happen next? I think the next priority for the evolution of Houston's innovation ecosystem.
We are still in the kind of a transition phase, I would say, but we are entering kind of a new period. I think when the Ion and when Greentown Labs opens, that is kind of a demarcation point a little bit in my mind. We're doing real numbers when it comes to venture capital funding now. We have $750 million that our startup companies are generating every year. And so I think going forward, it's just going to be a matter of growing clean energy jobs and clean energy startups here. The location of Greentown Labs coming in, which is the premier clean tech incubator in the country, that is going to do for clean energy what TMCX has done for life science. So it's going to be about, can we get more startups growing in clean energy? Can we get more jobs? Can we get more jobs on the research and innovation side of healthcare? We're already seeing that happen. Mm-hmm. And then the third would be, how much can we develop our commercial space hub around NASA? And there's a lot of movement in that area as well.
Yeah. You mentioned corporations, the large number of corporations headquartered here in Houston as a huge asset to the city's growth. But do you see these corporations really tapping into tech and innovation at this point? And what could they do more of?
You are seeing them support tech. I think that the biggest way that they support tech, honestly, is just by having very hard to solve problems that they're very interested in solving. And so the skill that is contained inside a lot of these companies with just highly skilled workers, they know better than anybody a lot of the problems the industry is facing right now, and they're better equipped to solve those problems than anyone else, right? And so you're starting to see some of these highly skilled, kind of mid-career experts spinning off their own companies. You see that in NASA engineers. There's a company called Mechatronics, right, that makes robots that go underwater. No one would have told you that was a problem that needed to be solved than an engineer inside NASA and seeing a vision for how to solve this. So there is also just the more tangible way that they're starting to pump more money into corporate venture funding. So Chevron Ventures, BP has a venture arm. A lot of the energy companies are starting to invest heavily in startups, which is good to see.
Mm-hmm. So you're the first director of data analytics for GHP. How did that role come to be?
I am. This is a new role in the last year. So we at the partnership are kind of mirroring the city a little bit in its transformation to being more of a digital first economy. And so at the partnership, we understood that there was going to be more of a need to use data in a more sophisticated way maybe than we have before, and just look at how can we be taking advantage of different data sources and tracking new indicators. And a part of that is, are there new indicators we can be watching that we haven't been watching before when it comes to the innovation economy? And so a big part of my role just in getting started over the last year is really developing a framework for what are the key indicators we want to be looking at for tracking our growth as an innovative economy. So just things like venture capital funding, but also tech specializations. What are the different verticals and the different sectors that we tend to excel at that maybe not every other metro tends to excel at? And so that's just been a part of our journey as well as an organization is kind of beefing up some of those skill sets.
And the GHP too, representing a collaborative of corporations across the city. How do those companies interact with this data, and how important is it to them?
Yeah, so we're constantly being asked by our members to provide insight on the local economy. And one area of need that we saw over the last few years was just companies wanting to know, hey, where do we stand when it comes to some of our digital tech assets? Where do we stand when it comes to some of our digital tech skills? And so it's definitely something that we've been providing more of. We have a new report, a new publication that covers a lot of this information. It's called the Houston Tech Report. It just came out. You can find it on our website, and it covers a lot of what we've been looking at.
So I know you're not originally from Houston, so tell me a little bit about your perspective, kind of moving into Houston and now taking on this role and really diving deep into the data of Houston.
Yeah, I'm originally from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I followed my wife here. Actually, when we were dating, she came here for a job in journalism. I was in Austin at the time. I moved to Houston in 2014. We got married, and I've loved Houston ever since. Being from Dallas, there's kind of a natural rivalry there. I never expected to live here, but I have to say it. Starting to come and visit my wife when she was here, we just had a blast. I was so surprised at how much fun we had with so many different things to do. Houston's a food town. We love to eat, and there's just an incredible amount of restaurants from all places in the world. It's so much fun. We just had a blast, and we've had a blast ever since. We raised our family here. We have a daughter. She's turning 3 next month. I can't believe it. And it's just Houston is our home now, and it's once you live in Houston, I think even if you don't always stay here, you take a piece of Houston with you. It kind of it becomes a part of you. Houston's a fun place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about Houston's perception problem, and you've just solved it.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I can't see us necessarily living anywhere else. It's home for us.
Yeah. Great. Well, it's so good to catch up with you and to really talk through the data behind the tech and innovation ecosystem in Houston.
Yeah, it was awesome talking to you too, Natalie.